Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome back again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville government, politics, business, education, really whatever gets our attention. My name is Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass, which you can find at CompassKnox.com. Joined, as always, by Scott Barker, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing today, Scott?
I'm doing just fine, Jesse. We are in the middle of winter, but it doesn't feel like it, and which was a big change from a couple of weeks ago. And but I'm good. How about you?
Yeah, I feel, for one thing, we're taping on a Friday, so it's always nice to get to the Friday for us. We can catch our breath before plunging into the next week, which will be busy next week, as this week was too. We're going to talk about both of those things. Quite a few things to talk about. We are, for a change from the past few weeks, apart from Scott's comment there, we're not really going to talk about weather. Isn't that nice? That weather is not newsworthy enough this week for us to talk about.
Todd Howell can breathe easy now.
That's right. We'll leave it happy to leave that one to the professionals. What we are going to talk about, the University of Tennessee got some unwelcome news this week about an NCAA investigation that both local and state officials are not happy about. We're going to talk about that. We are going to talk some more about the pending county elections. Several offices on the ballot, and we focused on a couple in particular this week. But to start us off, Scott, you did some good reporting this week on something that kind of first came to light the previous week, but it took a little while to figure out exactly what was going on here. And this is the pending closing of the Foyer, which is a low-barrier homeless shelter on Broadway, just north of downtown. What's going on there?
Well, that took some doing to figure out exactly what went on there. As you said, it popped up late the week before, Thursday, at a city council public hearing on emergency response to mental health crises and substance abuse crises, and one of the they had a lot of agencies there talking about the populations they served and what went on. One of those agencies was Volunteer Ministry Center. A city councilwoman, Lauren Ryder, took the opportunity to ask them about rumors that the Foyer was closing, and they said yes. And they said it was because the city had changed their funding. Basically it was that, and there was nobody from the city administration still at the meeting to address what they said, and it got really kind of confusing there. So I tried to uncover exactly what went on and why this is closing. And this shelter, it's a what's called a low barrier shelter, which means that to stay there, you don't have to, there aren't drug tests or no alcohol tests either. And, they don't need background checks. They don't do anything. And basically, if you walk in the door and you don't have a home, you can stay there. And
people can have pets.
They can have pets there. They can come as couples, which often isn't allowed in the other shelters, the more traditional shelters. There's no requirement that you attend a religious service of any kind or anything like that. So it really is designed to allow anybody to come in, and the idea is that getting into some sort of shelter and stabilizing your situation would then enable you to find actual housing. And VMC they've got caseworkers there to work with people. They put this requirement. They had a requirement that you had to do that. If you wanted to stay at the shelter, that's about the only requirement you had. You had to obey the law. You couldn't be violent, disruptive, but you had to develop a housing plan and work toward getting your actual housing.
Right. You're supposed to be making some sort of effort, however nominal, toward finding permanent housing.
Right. Now, there's only one problem with that. The funding for Foyer comes from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, a specific grant fund that they have, and they define low barrier shelters the same way I just described it, except you can't require people look for housing. You can encourage it. You can provide resources. You can't require it.
Right. The philosophical idea of the low barrier shelter being that any kind of requirement like that becomes a barrier.
Is a barrier, yes. And so,
this funding is federal, like you said, but it flows through the city of Knoxville.
Yes, I was going to get to that in a minute. But yeah, it flows through the city of Knoxville, and the city is responsible for making sure that the subrecipients adhere to all of those rules. However, I found out in the course of my reporting that the city doesn't audit or monitor or review, whatever word you want to use. They don't review every single program every year. And apparently, there'd been no reviews of this particular of the Foyer and its use of federal grant funding, and they just did that last year,
right? Because the Foyer just opened in 2021.
Well, no, it was in December of 2019.
Okay,
so it was right before the pandemic hit. In fact, the pandemic forced them. They opened with 40 beds. The pandemic forced them to reduce that number to space them out a little bit more to 30. But the last year, the city decided to review this. They did for a couple of reasons. One was the VMC went through a major leadership transition, and it ended up being multiple transitions. They basically have had 4 executive directors in the last year, but Bruce Spangler, who was the longtime head of VMC, retired. Then they hired a replacement who's only there for about 7 months, and this was during the time they were getting ready to. The city decided to look at this. Since then, he left, and then they had Bo Townsend, who was the former executive director at IAMS Nature Center, took over on an interim basis, and they just hired Tracy Williams, who's come here from Florida, extensive nonprofit experience. Her first week was 2 weeks ago. She barely is, she's, barely scratched the surface of what all VMC does. And VMC does a lot more than just run this one particular shelter. Anyway, and the city had also heard that there were people who were either prevented from entering the foyer or were staying at the foyer, and because they weren't following a housing plan, were asked to leave. That was the rumor. We don't really know exactly how that turned out. I don't want to say that but that's what led to the city to look at it. And when they did, they found out that, oh, wait a minute, they've got this requirement. They're not supposed to have this requirement that people look for housing. And so they contacted VMC, and I went through the back and forth that they had. And basically, VMC decided that if that wasn't a requirement that people look for housing, then they would not be able to continue managing the foyer.
Because it's not in line with their mission.
Right. Their mission is, okay, they've got programs to prevent homelessness. They have programs to house people. They run two of the largest permanent supportive housing complexes here, Minville Manor and Caswell Manor. But running a shelter isn't what they do. They didn't mind doing it because at the foyer, when they had that requirement, because that was part of their mission, was getting people into housing. So they decided that it didn't align with the mission anymore. They would pull out, and notify the city of that. It's kind of where the decision came from. It wasn't that the city decided to pull their funding. It wasn't that they're heartless and just decided they weren't going to do anything. It just was kind of an alignment of things that came together.
If VMC still wanted to do this, they absolutely could with the same funding from the city, but just removing that
they would have
whole housing component, essentially.
Right, and of course the housing component is what they do. So, they were going to focus elsewhere. There were some other financial things. Their rent went up significantly. They rent the space from the Salvation Army, which used to run a thrift store at the location. Rumors about this, people have been talking about it kind of under the radar for a few weeks, but it hadn't been discussed publicly. And so I think a lot of people thought it was a sudden decision, but obviously they began having talks about it last summer. The city, Mayor Kincannon, has said that the city's committed to try to support a low barrier shelter, because this is a one of a kind thing. The other shelters, the larger shelters, do have barriers, what you would call. So, so the city, the mayor said the city's committed to supporting a low barrier shelter, and the relatively new City County Office of Housing Stability is talking to potential operators of this. They don't have anything set in stone. Didn't say who they were talking with. That's, we assume it's a nonprofit, maybe a faith-based organization. The other shelters are faith-based organizations, operate them. So, so they're hoping to be able to have someone in place to hand the keys to at the end of March, when VMC is shutting down. That seems like a pretty aggressive timeline to me, just knowing how government operates. they're hoping for that, and obviously a new operator could change. It doesn't even have to be in the same place for one thing, but a new operator would have to, the program would have to be low barrier, and so that would be the thing. And VMC, you're talking about VMC. One of the things that Stacy Williams told me,
Tracy Williams.
I'm sorry, Tracy Williams.
She's so new that we don't know her name yet.
Anyway, she told me the VMC would be happy to provide case management people to work with anyone staying at the Foyer. If they want housing, that they'll help out. They just don't want to manage the day-to-day operations of the shelter.
Well, and I think it's worth keeping it in perspective, because this is it's relatively small, 30 to 40 beds, whereas like the Knoxville Area Rescue Mission has hundreds.
Yeah, they've got more than 300,
and so this is a much smaller operation. But the whole goal of it was to serve those people who, for various reasons, either don't want to go to those higher barrier shelters, or maybe have been kicked out of those higher barrier shelters, which there are folks that are in that situation too. It does seem to me, and maybe it's easier to see these things in retrospect, it's possibly a bit of a mismatch to have a low barrier shelter that by definition is going to bring in, probably some of your most quote unquote difficult cases in terms of case management, because a lot of times these are people who have already been excluded from other programs, or have just kind of, set their own course in a way that says, I don't really want to abide by anybody's restrictions or requirements, or I'm not capable of, or whatever. So to have a shelter that's explicitly trying to serve the most difficult and probably hardest to house population, but to have it run by an organization whose main focus is really on permanent housing.
Yeah.
And you could say that, well, this is the population, it's the least stable population, it's the one most in need of that kind of stability. And sure, but also is maybe the population most resistant to that kind of stability.
Yeah. I think that is that's going to be a challenge to anyone who operates a low barrier shelter, is that the population that you're serving is the population that is the most challenging to provide services to, and for whatever reason, like you said, it could be whether it's mental illness, whether it's recent criminal activity, whether it's substance abuse, whatever it is, and if you have a high barrier shelter, if someone shows up and they're obviously high, or they're obviously drunk, you can turn them away, and they do. And but it's a low barrier shelter, they're supposed to let you in. So, I mean, it's managing this population presents a lot of challenges. And remember, all social services agencies are having difficulty hiring and keeping employees, in part because some of them are hard. Like this. I mean, it's a hard job.
Yeah.
And
right. You think about working overnight at a low barrier shelter. That's hard work.
Yes, and it's not for everyone, and it's hard to find people who will do that, and that's another challenge that whoever operates it will have to face.
Sure. Well, obviously more to come on that, and I know you'll keep an eye on what happens as the city and the Office of Housing Stability look for a new contractor there. But, I think it does just, again, illustrate how difficult and complicated the entire universe of issues around homelessness are. It's not one population, the homeless population at any. First of all, it's a very fluid population. It changes day to day and week to week. Mm-hmm. But also there's lots of different sort of subgroups within that population mm-hmm. that need different levels or are looking for different levels of support and engagement. And every individual, especially that chronically homeless, street homeless population, every individual person in that group at any given time is kind of their own constellation of needs and challenges and difficulties. It's just, mm-hmm. It's one of these issues that I know people get very frustrated with, people from the left, people from the right, wherever you are in the political spectrum. Kind of nobody feels like anybody is doing enough of the things that they think needs to be done. But it's such a hard problem. It really is. It is.
And it's a problem that, a lot of times seems to be, insoluble. And, yet it problem needs to be addressed.
Well, and one of the interesting things that VMC said was that because their mission is about moving people, they kind of want to see some quote unquote progress of going from being less stable to being more stable to eventually having housing, and that they didn't want to be involved in just management.
Right.
But the reality is a certain amount of day-to-day homeless services really are exactly that. It really is managing,
right?
Because those longer term solutions, to whatever degree they can be brought to bear on any one case, it might take a very long. Even if you are successful, it might take a very long time in any individual case. And so there is going to be just a lot of day-to-day management. Like, yes, this person or this group of people have these longer term, big picture issues that we need to solve, but they also need a place to sleep tonight.
Right.
And so there is always going to be, now that doesn't mean that VMC or any given provider obviously is obligated to do that management part of it, but a certain amount of this is always just going to be managing those day-to-day needs.
Right. And one of the broader housing issue has placed to bear on this. There is a shortage of affordable housing. Everyone who is in this situation who would be moving into housing would have to have, what we call affordable housing, and there's a shortage of it. So even those who want to, who come up with a housing plan and want to work toward getting a place to stay, if they can't find an apartment that they can move into, they're stuck at the shelter.
Right. All right. Well, obviously, there will be more to say about all that in the months ahead. Elections. As we keep reminding you, there is a county election, a county primary coming up on Tuesday, March 5th. It's the same day as the presidential primary in Tennessee and in many other states. And it's a super crowded county ballot. And so we've kind of been working through, and we will continue to in the coming weeks, looking at the various races on the ballot. A couple things happened this past week. First of all, there was a candidate forum with candidates from the 4 school board seats that are up. This was another forum that I moderated, organized by the League of Women Voters and a host of partner organizations. And we had 5, there are 10 school board candidates on the ballot. 5 of them showed up. The 5 who didn't had various reasons, prior commitments. One was going out of town for an anniversary trip with his wife. It was interesting and in line with experience of other recent election cycles that of the 10 candidates, the 5 who showed up at this forum were 3 Democrats, 1 Republican, and 1 independent. The 5 who did not show up were 4 Republicans and an independent. This, for various reasons, in recent times, Knox County Republican candidates have been less likely to come to these kinds of public forums than candidates who are not Republican. There's a lot of reasons for that. We don't need to go into debating all of them right now. But that was the situation. It was an interesting conversation. A lot of issues that you would expect to come up in a school board forum in 2024 came up. School vouchers, school funding, whether the county might need a property tax increase at some point in this century if they really want to have the resources to provide better pay to teachers and more staffing and whatever that some of these candidates talked about. So you can find our coverage of that on our website. And if you are not a Compass subscriber, now is a great time to become one, because we really are going to be focusing on these elections both ahead of the primary, ahead of the county general in August, and then of course we will have the state elections coming up in November, in addition to the presidential election that everybody's paying attention to, and you don't need us for that, but you do need us for these other races. And so if you are a subscriber, of course, you can go and read those. We will, I do want to say, because we are civic-minded, we're not just here to make a buck. We're not opposed to making a buck. But every election cycle, when we get to early voting, we do go ahead and move all of our election coverage outside the paywall. And so if you don't want to sign up for a subscription, it makes us a little bit sad. But you can just wait a couple of weeks. And when we get to early voting, which starts soon, it starts February 14th, Valentine's Day. Nothing says romance like Knox County primary elections. All of our election coverage will be moved outside of our paywall.
I can't think of a better first date than taking your new special person to the early voting location.
Absolutely. If you do that on a first date, should you disclose to each other who you voted for? Is this a good way to kind of do some instant screening, or should you wait?
I would think that it could definitely clear some things up earlier than later, maybe. Yeah. I certainly know a few people that if I told them I voted for X, they would never talk to me again, and so there's no need for a second date if that's the case.
There's been interesting surveys about this at the national level. People who are strongly ideologically identified with one political party or another, or one political position or another, are increasingly unlikely to want to date people from kind of the other camp. And that's probably always been true to some degree, but as we've gone through various kinds of demographic sorting that there's been a lot of talk about, that's become even more true. And so, yeah, you're right. That might be a good good way to just kind of say, you know what, you seem nice, but I don't think it's going to work out.
I think it could make a great dating show too. We could spin off we could turn into MTV here and just start doing dating shows, and spin off into a first date election day and see how that goes.
What do you get when a libertarian dates a Marxist? A couple of other things we did talk about or in our coverage this week related to the election. We had profiles of the county commission Republican primary races in districts 4 and 6. Those are both interesting races. The District 4 seat is that's West Knoxville, kind of from Sequoia Hills out to North Shore Town Center along North Shore, and also including West Hills. That's an open seat because incumbent Commissioner Kyle Ward is not seeking re-election. He's a Republican. That seat has traditionally, mostly, though not exclusively, been held by Republicans. But that district, as we have talked about, is in flux. Interestingly, in the school board race there in 2022, Democrat Catherine Bike defeated very well-funded Republican Will Edwards. And so that district appears to be very much in play for both parties. But of course, we are right now just focusing on the primaries. And so there is a primary contest there. Garrett Holt, who is a young candidate, youngest person on the ballot. He's 30 years old, ran previously for city council back in 2021. And he did not win. He performed about the same as the other Republican candidates on that slate that ran in 2021. And he was in a difficult district because that city council district he was in at the time was a very Democratic district, a minority district, as a white guy Republican in a West Knoxville neighborhood. You know,
it was tough sled.
It was an uphill battle. He's on more level ground here in District 4 in the commission race. But his first big challenge is getting through this Republican primary, and he is being challenged by Liz Tombras, who is the oldest candidate on the ballot. So you have if you're a Republican in District 4, you have two fairly different candidates, a very young man or a more senior female candidate. Of course, Liz Tombras said, she said, I don't think of myself as 83. I've got lots of energy. I'm looking for a new challenge. She's a retired advertising executive. Garrett Holt works as a mortgage broker. And Liz Tombras basically has two major issues with Holt. The first is that she doesn't think he's a real Republican. And she and Gary Lowe with the West Knox Republican Club filed challenges to Holt's eligibility to run as a Republican. They filed these with the Republican Party, basically saying that he doesn't meet some criteria. He hasn't voted in 3 out of the last 4 statewide Republican primaries, which is one of their requirements. And they're also upset that he voted in 2016, he voted in the Democratic presidential primary. And so that's a big verboten. You cannot
big red
do
flag
that.
for them.
Right. But that got turned down by the party. And part of the reasoning that the party officials made on this was, we just supported him in 2021 as a Republican. Like we've already gone through this. We've already said, yes, he's okay. And so he's kind of came pre-qualified. I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact that he's actually being supported by a lot of the Republican establishment. And I think he's raised substantially more money than Tombras had. Well, actually, I'm somewhat assuming that Tombras, last time I checked, had not actually filed her finance disclosure form, but by her own account, she only got into the race late. She has not been out there. Holt's been raising money for, I think, about a year for this, and Tombras has not been. And he's received money from a lot of establishment Republican donors, developers. That is another one of Tombras's argument against Holt, is that she says, well, he's involved with the development community, and he says no, he works in commercial real estate. He's not actually a developer himself. But he certainly knows developers, and he has gotten donations from developers. That's true. Both of them say that, in fact, they would focus on kind of meat and potatoes issues in the district, especially having to do with infrastructure, trying to deal with some of the very congested roads and highways that we have through these already quite built up West Knoxville neighborhoods and subdivisions. So in terms of the issues that they see, it didn't seem to be a lot of huge disagreements before them. For Tombras, it's much more about being, as she says, the only real conservative candidate. Holt, in a way, is not trying to compete with her on that. He said, I'm when it comes down to it, I'm a fairly moderate guy. And I think that his argument is that so is that district. That 4th district is, like we were saying, it's a fairly purplish district. It's not super blue. It's not super red. And so a Republican who presents himself as a more moderate candidate, if he can get through the Republican primary, could actually be a stronger candidate in the general election, because there is a very well-funded Democrat running there, Shane Jackson, in the 4th district, who is coming in with a lot of support, including from some Republicans. He has some donations from some Republicans too. And I think the Democrats definitely see that seat as their most winnable pickup in this election if they were going to pick up any of them. Much different situation in the District 6 Republican primary. That's between Terry Hill, who is the current commission chair, and Julie McBee Fritz, who is running her first ever campaign. And that area covers Karnes and Hardin Valley. It's the part of the county that has really borne the brunt of a lot of the growth over the past couple of decades. Speaking of overwhelmed infrastructure, its infrastructure is overwhelmed. They're getting traffic backups on roads all through Hardin Valley and into the Karnes area. And people are still going in and putting in new subdivisions out there. It is, it's much more built up than it was 20 years ago, but that kind of continues apace. And Hill takes I would say sort of big picture, she would say pragmatic view of growth there, that she thinks there does need to be growth and there is going to be growth, but it also needs to be balanced with the needs of the existing residents, with trying to remedy some of the infrastructure situations. She's generally supportive of the advanced Knox planning process and the changes to the growth policy plan that Mayor Jacobs has proposed. McBee Fritz is much more skeptical of that whole process, and she believes that the voices of the people who have come out and spoken in opposition to or in skepticism of that plan, and who fear that it's just going to lead to more and more development that's going to continue to overwhelm the infrastructure. She thinks those voices haven't been heard and that the whole thing, needs to slow down. And so she's kind of running a grassroots, representing the voices of local residents. Her family goes back there decades. Her husband's family goes back there centuries, and really just kind of trying to preserve what they can of the quality of life in those areas. Because she is running that kind of grassroots campaign, she has raised very little money. She reported just like $2,000. Hill has raised a lot more than that from a lot of deep-pocketed Republican donors, including some developers. But also, she's being supported by her fellow commissioner, Kim Frazier, who lives in Hardin Valley and who is one of those voices calling for better planning, more circumspection about growth and so forth. And so it's not like all of Hill's support is coming from one area. I think looking at that race, Hill obviously comes into it as a presumptive favorite. She has won 3 elections in that district. She was elected without opposition to commission in 2020, and then she was elected twice to school board representing the same district in 2014 and 2018. Her family is very politically engaged there. Both her husband, Steve Hill, and her daughter, Cindy Buttry, former school board members. Steve Hill, or Cindy Buttry's husband, Steve Buttry, a former state legislator and now a lobbyist. They're a very politically connected and well-known family. And so I think you'd have to give Hill the edge there. But it is true that we have seen a lot of elections in recent years go in favor of people who are the loudest about their resistance to and skepticism of developers and development. And so I'm sure Hill is not taking this casually.
No, in one of the factors there is because that area has grown so fast and because a lot of people are concerned, they're probably, and I don't have nothing to base this on, but they're probably angrier about development issues than they were 4 years ago.
Yep.
When Hill ran the first time. So
yeah, and she has over that time voted to approve a number of subdivisions. She's raised questions about a lot of them, and she has asked for conditions to be imposed on them. But she has not been, a stumbling block or a big flashing red light saying no development. She's been kind of trying to navigate that. So we will see what happens there along with all the other county races. We will have more coverage of these races in the coming weeks on our website, in our daily newsletter. You can find that, of course, at compassknox.com. You can find basic information about the upcoming election, who's on the ballot, where the polling places are, what the early voting schedule is. That's, again, from February 14th to February 27th, ahead of the March 5th election. You can find all of that at knoxvotes.org, which is the website of the Knox County Election Commission. One other thing I just wanted to mention there, because we did get the most recent round of campaign finance disclosures in those county races this week, and we'll be writing more about that next week. But one that stood out to me, the county law director's race, there's a Republican primary there where David Book, who is the incumbent seeking a second term, very well-known name in county politics, he is being challenged by another fairly well-known name in county politics, which is Daniel Herrera. This is another age gap thing. Herrera's pretty young. Book's in his 70s. Book has been practicing law for well over 40 years. Herrera's been practicing law for 4 years. Yeah. And Herrera is the former chair of the Knox County Republican Party, who was somewhat controversial as chair. He did some things that some of the more establishment Republican figures were not happy with, including some of the guests he brought to town to speak at the annual Lincoln Day dinner that the Republican Party has. He brought in Charlie Kirk, the fiery, I guess you could say, controversial founder of Turning Point USA. He brought in Lauren Boebert, the perennially controversial congresswoman from Colorado. He very much appealing to kind of the energized Trumpy wing, I guess, of the local party. And
he also was one of the driving forces behind the Republican Party basically putting up a slate of candidates in the nonpartisan city council election 2 years ago or 3 years ago now. That failed.
The one that Garrett Holt
ran in, and all of those candidates lost.
Yeah.
So it was a very high I mean, this wasn't the traditional behind the scenes. Oh yeah, wink wink, he's a Republican, or wink wink, he's a Democrat. This was the party helped fund them, they helped support them, they helped them with campaigning, and they all lost.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of things you can do in politics, but losing elections is not one of them. So.
Right. Well, so now Herrera is trying to win an election of his own, but I think you would tend to look at him as a bit of an underdog because, first of all, one thing that came out this past week was a survey from the Knoxville Bar Association, and the Knoxville Bar Association surveys its members on all judicial seats and positions related to law enforcement, which includes the county law director as well as the district attorney general. And they don't make endorsements, but they rate each candidate. And so there's three candidates running for county law director: Book, Herrera, and then Democrat Jackson Fenner. And Book was recommended for re-election by a majority of those who responded. Fenner, the majority of those who responded, said they didn't know enough about him to give a ranking. Herrera, the majority of those who responded did not you can check strongly recommend, do not recommend, strongly do not recommend. 54%,
right around 54%
of people who responded either did not recommend or strongly did not recommend Herrera. 42% of those. So 42% of those who responded strongly did not recommend Herrera. He does not come with what you would call strong credentials, at least as far as the legal community in Knoxville is concerned. But he has raised a lot of money. He's raised over $40,000, more than twice as much as the $20,000 that Book reported. But Book's $20,000 was actually only $5,000 from donors and $15,000 in loans from himself. So Herrera's actually out in terms of donations from contributors. Herrera is outpacing Book by like an 8-to-1 plus margin. What does that mean? I mean, it's interesting if you look at who's donating to Herrera. A lot of that money is coming from people who have been active in, you would say the more far-right reaches of local politics. A lot of people who were involved in the anti-mandate movement during the COVID pandemic, people who kind of identify as quote-unquote constitutional conservatives, who want to take a very combative, very ideological approach to basically all offices, all the way down to county and city and school board offices. And so that's kind of the wing of the party that's supporting Herrera, which does not necessarily translate into like a majority of local Republicans. But, he put up some pretty good numbers there. And if I were Book, maybe anticipating this not being much of a real challenge, maybe those numbers give you a little bit of pause.
Yeah, I mean, those are two interesting things that happened in that race. And the Bar Association thing, of course, that looked really bad for Herrera and really good for Book. But, the electorate is made up of more than just attorneys. And so it's
which on balance is probably a good thing.
It probably is, and so the there's a lot more to running for office than just appealing to people in your own profession and all, and a lot of that is raising enough money to run a countywide race and to be able to do it with and it shows it. I mean, it does show support, regardless of where exactly that support is coming from. That's something that he can take to get to other donors and say, hey, look, I've got X number of donors and I've outraised big so far, so I'm the guy, and so we'll see if that momentum continues for him.
Yeah, and Book is theoretically vulnerable, and we're going to be talking about that race some more when we do a deeper look at it in a few weeks. But there were people who were unhappy with how the law director's office handled issues during the pandemic. There have been people both on county commission and on the school board in recent years who have raised concerns about the law director's office. Whether that translates into those people then going and saying that Herrera is the change that they want to see there, who knows? We'll see. There is also a public forum in that race coming up next week, which we'll be telling you about later in the podcast. Do not know yet whether all of the candidates are going to be attending that, but that'll be an opportunity to at least hear from some of them. So lots more election news and discussion to come in the coming weeks. All right, Scott, one other thing we wanted to talk about this week was the University of Tennessee heard from the NCAA, and they were not happy about it. What happened?
The NCAA has met with UT officials, and they basically have told them that they are investigating UT for recruiting violations in multiple sports, and it's all related to the whole name, image, and likeness rules that the NCAA has. This is this is coming on the heels of of UT being on probation. They were put on probation last summer and fined $8 million for violations when Jeremy Pruitt was the coach. And so now UT is not taking this sitting down. They met with Plowman, who then Dante Plowman, the chancellor at UT, who then wrote a scathing letter to the NCAA about their inconsistencies in these rules and in both their guidance for them and their application of them and investigating them. And then the next day, on last Wednesday, the Tennessee Attorney General, Jonathan Skrmetti, filed a lawsuit along with the Attorney General in Virginia, basically asking the court to order the NCAA to bug off. That their rules were silly, and this is a big. It's been a big issue in college sports the last couple of years. This since a 2021 Supreme Court decision that allows student athletes at colleges and universities to take advantage of their, be compensated for the use of their name, image, or likeness. In other words, endorsements. They can endorse products and businesses and that sort of thing. And in response, a lot of what are known as collectives, they're basically booster groups, sprang up to support, to provide this kind of funding, to be a funnel for money to these student athletes. And that is just about everybody is doing that. UT does it. University of Alabama does it. University of Florida does it. Vanderbilt does it. Everybody does it. But and it's legal as long as they're in school. Where the NCAA hasn't issued or at least as of the time we're taping this, had not issued an official notice of allegations, but it appears that everything revolves around recruiting. Now, these collectives can sign contracts with students who are enrolled. But if you haven't enrolled in school yet, they're not supposed to use that as an inducement to get you to go to a school.
There's not supposed to be a quid pro quo. Like, if you come to our school, we guarantee you that you will get X amount of money per year from these endorsements.
Right. And now these collectives do this because the coaching staffs are not allowed to do it. They're not allowed to tinker with it. And it's understandable because the whole idea is that these endorsements are individual personal endorsements, and the coaching, the coaches don't do that. They're not the source of the funding. They're not anything. One of the New York Times has reported that one of the issues that the NCAA is looking into is the local collective Spire Sports group paid for a private jet flight for Nico. Forgive me, Imaliva. I believe is how he's Yamaliava, whatever. I don't.
Somebody call in and correct us.
I don't feel bad because the sports radio guys here in Knoxville, they just call him Nico. Nobody wants to touch his last name as far as pronouncing it. Anyway, that he was given a flight. They paid for a flight here while he was in high school, which that's always been. I mean, up before the era of name, image, and likeness, that was not allowed either. And so, but the NCAA has been vague in some ways. They've been their guidance to the various universities has shifted several times, and that is one of the reasons that that the University of Tennessee and the state of Tennessee are fighting so vigorously. Right,
Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti wading into this fray as well.
Yeah, and that lawsuit has the potential to really force either the NCAA to completely change what they're doing or validates what the NCAA is doing. This kind of it's this whole endorsement era of college sports really has people don't even know what to make of it. Like again, a similar thing, Florida State University, they got just slapped with some sanctions because a coach drove a player to the sports collective offices so he could sign his contract.
Mm-hmm.
And that's these are the things, and UT UT has another reason to fight this vigorously, and that's because they are, as I mentioned before, already on probation.
Mm-hmm.
5-year probation. If they get sanctions again, they could get really severe sanctions because they would be the NCAA could determine that they lack institutional control. That's that opens the door to the most severe penalties that they can.
Right. Whereas UT is saying we don't lack institutional control. We don't know what the rules are. And by the way, NCAA, neither do you really.
Neither do you, yeah. And what's funny is UT was open and compliant with the previous investigation into Jeremy Pruitt's time at UT, and the NCAA praised UT for being so open and so cooperative. In fact, we kind of went light on them because of that. So and Plowman made mention of that when 6 months ago we were we were a model for other schools to follow, and now you're investigating us. What's going on? So
well, and it really does get into just how there's been a core dishonesty at the heart of college sports forever, right? We all know this for a long, long time, especially around football and basketball. There's so much money that surrounds the sport. And this has always been the argument for the athletes being able to be paid because everybody else is. Coaches are making millions of dollars. The universities are making millions of dollars. The TV stations, the sports networks are making millions of dollars. And so but it was all, there was this mythology of amateurism that needed to be protected. And over time, that just became increasingly difficult to justify as anything except you were exploiting unpaid labor.
Yeah.
Yes, they got scholarships, but we all know that there's a big difference between getting a scholarship to UT and getting a check for $50,000 or whatever. And so this name, image, likeness, openness was kind of like the NCAA is kind of trying, and of course there's also a legal landscape where there have been lawsuits filed over this, and the NCAA kind of if they didn't do something, they were probably going to eventually have a judge somewhere say, come on, you got to pay people for this work.
I still love the model though. It's always what cracks me up about it is they somehow got away with the NCAA at large, and the universities in particular still aren't paying the kids.
Right.
We bring a third party.
They've outsourced.
I want that. I want to have somebody else pay for my employees.
Well, but that shows you what's happened as a result. That's the approach they tried to take. But then immediately we're seeing the weakness of that because theoretically the NIL thing was about a local car dealership could pay a football player $800 to come and appear there, and it's not that some of those things aren't happening. But really what's happening is that those same boosters who have always played a role in these things, and we've always had scandals where some booster was buying a kid a car or whatever.
$100 handshake.
Right. They have now kind of rushed into this newly opened, but not super clearly defined crack in the door or camel nose under the tent or whatever metaphor you want to use. And looked to do the same kinds of things that they have always done, but they were kind of doing, against the rules, and now trying to do those under these new rules. And the NCAA is kind of saying, well, like, that's not what we meant. We didn't mean that all of your rich donors can just get together and form a big pot of money that then you just kind of dispense. But, like, of course that's what's going to happen. And I guess we'll see how this shakes out, obviously, and whether they come in with either some clearer definitions that then they are really going to try to police, or if they back off of this and say, okay, or even if we eventually move towards some greater openness where people can just be paid for the work that they're performing and let the market set that rate, which is what happens in professional sports. I don't know, but this feels like it's like the NIL thing was supposed to be a solution to these long-standing hypocrisies around the sport, and it's gone partway there, but what it's also doing is just kind of continuing to illuminate those same hypocrisies.
Oh, absolutely. To Seth's point, they aren't getting paid for their work. They're
getting paid for their side hustle.
Yeah. Well, it's the difference between an NFL player and an SEC football player is the NFL player
gets paid by the team,
and makes endorsements.
Yep.
College players don't get paid by the team, but they can make money off endorsements. So, they're still not getting paid for their work.
Right.
And that's one way to look at it, other than the scholarship and the other perks they get. So
right. Yep. Well, certainly interesting, and
well, this is going to be something that people in East Tennessee are going to be fascinated with. They're already livid about it because this is big orange country. This is college sports, especially UT sports, everything to a lot of people here, and so there's going to be quite a bit of interest in this moving forward. It's so big that even we are talking about it.
Yeah.
and real quick, for just a quick plug of shameless self-promotion, I intend to do a segment on my podcast this week about it. If you haven't checked it out, Almost in Agreement. And I have real solutions that everybody will hate, and I would love for you guys to listen to that and then email me and tell me how wrong I am. But it's just one of those, like, this one in particular is one of those, like, everybody knows the right answer, but nobody wants to do it. And it's just crazy.
I know you have the Almost in Agreement podcast, but you should have a spinoff of that that's just called Seth Solves It. And we could just work through all of our big issues.
I mean, that's kind of what the show is anyway.
And it would just be, and here's Seth to solve this for us. We will look forward to listening to that.
I maybe too often assume myself right, which sometimes gets me in trouble. Most of the time.
All right. Well, that walks us through everything from the past week. Let's take a quick break here. We will come back for our Q&A segment. We are going to talk about the Knoxville housing market. All right, we are to the question and answer part of the podcast. Every week, or whenever we remember to do it, we go onto our subscriber-only Facebook page, The Compass Colloquy, which you can join if you're a Compass subscriber, which you can become at CompassKnox.com. And we ask our readers if there are any issues beyond the obvious headlines that they would like to hear about on the podcast. One of the questions we got this week was, it has to be said from a self-interested reader, Hanson Sale, who's been on the podcast before and is the legislative director for East Tennessee Realtors. He said, what about the Knoxville housing market? And the reason that he said this was because Hanson and the East Tennessee Realtors this past week released their housing forecast for 2024. We have talked a lot about housing in Knoxville and Knox County here on the podcast, mostly in the terms that there is not enough of it. There's more demand than there is supply, and that has had all of the effects that we have talked about with skyrocketing housing prices, both for people who are looking to buy houses, also for rental rates. And so, Scott, how are things looking for 2024?
Well, according to the realtors, the 2024 is going to be the market's going to ease up a little bit. It's been very difficult to buy a house, but that's going to be a little bit easier this year, according to them. That's their projection anyway. Now, one of the things that they talked about too was interest rates, which if they end up going back down a little bit, should stimulate people to actually go out to start buying houses, because interest rates are high. People don't want to buy. They don't. Mm-hmm. They don't want to pay the extra
locking
money.
Yourself into a 30-year payment.
Yeah. Now the problem is there are going to be people who are going to be looking for houses and all. Prices aren't going to be changing that much though, and they won't be growing as fast as they have over the past 2 or 3 years, but they still will be. They're not going to come down.
And that's mostly going back to that supply issue, right? That there's still a kind of backlog of demand that's going to keep those prices high.
Oh, absolutely, and we're starting to see a little bit of the opposite effect in the rental market in apartments. Rents had been rising here dramatically as well. They've started to they're still going up, but a much slower rate than they had been before. And so,
Right, because last year we were for a while the fastest rising rental market in the country, and we had double-digit year-over-year increases.
I know, no, it's down now. It's down around 3%, I believe, was what the number was in the report. And then so they attribute that to more apartments coming online and more apartments opening up, and you can there are places you can see that there is a lot of apartment construction. All you got to do is drive down Cumberland Avenue. We're going to have a couple thousand more come on the market there just in the next year or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the statistics that I thought was interesting, because there's been talk about part of the problem with supply coming onto the market as these mortgage rates have gone up is that people who currently own houses, a lot of them who financed or refinanced over the past decade, often have quite low interest rates, because we went through that long period coming out of the 2008 recession where interest rates were just low. And even people who maybe otherwise would be looking to move have been hesitant to, because you don't want to sell a house that you have a low interest mortgage rate on and buy a house at a much higher rate, because that just makes that property that much more expensive to you. And this report put some real numbers to that. It showed that of current outstanding mortgages in Tennessee, 21% of those mortgages are at rates below 3%.
Wow.
Those are very low rates. And then another 36% are between 3 and 4%. So that's a majority of people with existing mortgages. 57% of them are at 4% or below. And of course, right now, the rates out on the market are more like in the 7% range. And so that has had this, what they call the lock-in effect, where even people who want to move are kind of feel stuck for the moment. And so again, as you're saying, as those interest rates even out and maybe even start declining, if the Fed really does follow through with some cuts to the rate by the end of the year, which is still unclear, that might move some of those people who have been wanting to move but have felt financially constrained from doing it to put their houses on the market, which will then also help meet that demand.
Yeah, the one interesting thing about watching the housing market over the past couple of years, has been that this was unprecedented. The increase in demand from people moving to East Tennessee, increase in prices, increases in rent, all of that happened all at the same time, and it's I think that a lot of people in the industry are feeling a little bit of relief that things are moderating somewhat. They're still going up.
Right.
The market's still good.
Nobody is predicting that you're suddenly going to find a bunch of bargains on the market.
No, but
you might be able to find something on the market.
Yeah, and you might be able to find something, and you might be able to find it at a low enough interest rate in the future to actually the mortgage.
So if you want to see more of that report, it is at etnrealtors.com, the website of the East Tennessee Realtors. Interesting stuff. All right, let's look ahead to the coming week. We have quite a few things on the schedule. County Commission on Monday will have a meeting at 2 p.m. in the main assembly room of the City County building. And this is a meeting, it's an informational session on the Advanced Knox planning process and the growth policy plan that was originally scheduled last month. It was actually scheduled twice last month and got rescheduled twice because of the weather, but the forecast looks pretty good over the weekend, so I think they're actually going to be able to have this meeting, and it'll be a chance for county commissioners to really hear about where that whole process is now that the Growth Policy Coordinating Committee has signed off on County Mayor Glenn Jacobs' proposed changes to the growth plan. They'll also get a chance to talk a little bit about the comprehensive land use plan that the county's putting forward that we're also going to talk about in a minute because that's coming to Planning Commission this week. The school board is meeting twice, having their monthly meetings on Monday and Thursday, the work session on Monday, the voting meeting on Thursday. Both of those are at 5 p.m. in the Summer Place boardroom. And nothing super exciting on the agenda. They will have discussion of what to do with their snow day situation, because as we know, they used up everything they had banked during the almost 2 weeks that students were out of school because of the weather. And so they'll be talking about how to deal with that. Then City Council is meeting on Tuesday.
Yeah, City Council's meeting, nothing earth-shattering. They're going to be going into the, a few weeks ago we talked about the 22-bedroom duplex that developer wants to build in the Fort Sanders neighborhood, and so far it's been denied, but they've appealed the decision to deny to the City Council. They'll hear that appeal on Tuesday. And another kind of interesting thing is there is a request by Scott and Bernadette West, who run businesses in Market Square, and they are developing the area where the International operated for a while. Right, you can see it as you're crossing the Western Avenue Viaduct. It's the top of the building is right there
on Blackstock, or off Blackstock.
Off Blackstock. They are asking that area where those buildings are be renamed, kind of officially, unofficially renamed, the Asylum Avenue District. For those who don't know, there used to be an Asylum Avenue. It went to the mental hospital. It went through that area, and they're apparently wanting to use that to help market those properties as.
Anybody familiar with the West's other properties will not be surprised that they find the name Asylum attractive.
Yes. And you know, well, it is a little crazy. Anyway, the West, they've got a little bit of a flair for kind of being creative like that, and this is an area that is not because it's right by the interstate. It was one of those areas that was basically destroyed by the construction of the interstate. It's really been underutilized for a long time, and it's an effort to pump some life into this area.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then Planning Commission is also meeting this week, right?
Yeah, Planning Commission is meeting. They're going to be looking at the county's comprehensive land use plan,
which this is the plan that is built on top of the advanced Knox process and also on top of the proposed changes that Mayor Jacobs has introduced, which those changes to the growth policy plan still need to be separately approved by City Council, County Commission, and the Farragut Board of Mayor and Aldermen. But this comprehensive land use plan is moving through the Planning Commission now under the assumption because some of the things that are in it rely on those changes being made to the growth policy plan, but it's moving sort of alongside the big picture changes to the growth policy plan. But this is where the county is putting some more detail into how development is going to be guided in the future in Knox County, and it'll be interesting to see. There has been a lot of discussion at the meetings about the growth policy plan. Be interesting to see if some of the people who have raised concerns about that also show up at Planning Commission to raise similar issues.
Yeah, and it would not. I would imagine they will. This is one of those things where, with the growth policy plans, more big picture. This is bringing that picture into more focus, and there are several people who've raised concerns about the details of implementing the growth policy plan. So, and this is the first step toward doing that.
Yep. All right. Well, we will be back next week to talk about all of those things and anything else that happens in the interim. I guess one other thing we might want to mention is that Governor Bill Lee is going to be giving the State of the State address on Monday, which we will cover from a distance and report on anything specifically applicable to Knoxville and Knox County. But you can also look at Tennessee Lookout, the Tennessean, our Nashville-based state coverage outlets for coverage of that. And anything else we want to mention here?
I'm good.
All right. Well, everybody, I hope you've had a good weekend. Have a good week, and we'll talk to you later.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.